Thank you very much. Welcome to this last session of the day. Of what has been, I think, so far, we've had extraordinary examples of the kind of theorization that is going on in India about the Indian experience and what is happening in the world. And we've also had very innovative use of categories and bringing in new categories through which that experience has been categorized. I only want to come in here to say that we've had exemplary chairpersons who have been steeped in, I think, what has been defined today as the Indian tradition, showing great deal of self-restraint and inwardness. I have none of those virtues. I don't know where I'm located, maybe some space of hybridity. So speakers are warned, because I will be a little self-indulgent and give myself more time, and everybody else a little less. I have still to inculcate some virtues, so there is some other aim further in my life, something I have to achieve. Over to Professor Ajay Gudavati. Looking forward to hearing everyone here.
हम भी कोई गुरु शिष्य परंपरा से तो नहीं आते तो you can expect. Okay, so let me begin by profusely thanking my good friend Maninder for always dragging us into lively debates, and I think since yesterday we have had some very lively opening statements followed up by some very interesting debates on both post-coloniality and decolonization. What I really wish to do is to raise a kind of a contextual questions that how do we have had this debate for over now half a century, beginning with Frantz Fanon, that it's time that we revisit some of the questions that both post-colonial theory and decolonization have been raising. My sense is that while this debate has been extremely productive, especially in terms of bringing the locationality of post-colonial societies, but is it really addressing some of the emergent questions that globally we are facing in the turn of 21st century? Okay. Or has this debate become somewhat self-referential in terms of addressing its own predecessors, the kinds of tones and questions that have been set in the late 20th century? Are they still addressing those questions, or are there some new questions that we might have to formulate in order to make better sense of some kind of a new post-colonial and decolonial theory? So for this, let me raise three broad questions. Those are central concerns. I think the debate here has generally been very broad. So I'll try and pin on certain key formulations that both post-colonial theory and decolonization have made, certain very specific concepts that they have allured to, and make kind of a very tentative formulation that why I feel there is a need to revisit some of these formulations. A good place to begin this with, I feel, is the Iranian American scholar Behrouz Gamari, who has this fascinating book called Foucault in Iran. And he says that, Behrouz revisits this question as to why was French philosopher Michel Foucault excited with Iranian Revolution of 1979, that while the liberal academia of France thought that what we were witnessing was an unmitigated, unadulterated, theocratic rebellion, but Foucault thought otherwise, and he thought that there is something very interesting happening in terms of the creative potential of Islam beyond the domestication of legalism that Europe went through, and therefore he coins a very interesting category called political spirituality. He says what Iran is witnessing on the streets against the martial police is a political spirituality where there is a certain elevation from your social and civic locations, and people rise to face death, this inevitability. He says that they prefer the finality of death over the predictability of submission before the authorities. And he says this is nothing but a very spiritual kind of an experience that comes from an Islamic imagination. That's the reading that Foucault makes of. And therefore, Behrouz goes on to argue, though, that this is the context in which he says, I'm quoting from his book, is it possible for a people to envision and desire futures uncharted by already existing schemata of historical change and patterns of social change? Is it possible to think of dignity, humility, justice, and liberty outside Enlightenment cognitive maps and principles? I think this is at the heart of both postcolonial reimagination of institutions and decolonial epistemic disobedience, that how can we imagine categories, how can we imagine social life as such outside the compulsions of progressive temporalities? Why should we already have a given schemata of change? So therefore, how do we think that something becomes a theocratic revolution? For instance, Foucault would argue in the Iranian context, only when you look at it from the modernization point of view. If you drop that schemata of linear transformation, then there are other possibilities, very fertile possibilities that one can imagine, and that's what he thought Iran was going through. So he makes a very wonderful, interesting distinction between pure moment of revolt, which is that moment of political spirituality, where your imagination is elevated beyond the constraints of the social and beyond the constraints of history. And then he says, of course, what followed later was the programmatic revolution, which kind of domesticated that pure moment of revolt. So Foucault, I think it's an extremely creative intervention that Foucault makes in terms of how one needs to reimagine. So I think this remained at the heart of postcolonial and decolonization, and that's why it's such an important project. But how far have we really come from in kind of hinting, in kind of suggesting, I would call it a theoretical nudge? My broad sense is that postcolonial decolonization theory of last half century has failed to emerge as a theory. This question of Indian political theory, that I don't see there's a systematic theory behind it, but what you do have is a kind of a theoretical nudge. And my broad sense is that that's where it is going to remain. That it is continuously going to give us theoretical hints, suggestions, it will nudge us to think. But has it in itself produced a systematic theory where we can actually begin to question Enlightenment epistemology, the kind of categories Enlightenment has produced? That's my larger thrust that I'm provoking you to think. So now turning to some specific formulations, why do I feel this way? Why is that there is a kind of a stagnation that postcolonial theory and decolonization has faced in the later part of 20th century? Is let me turn to certain specific formulations and wedge open some gaps that have, I think, remained somewhat institutionalized, and those engaging with these frameworks have kind of steadily refused to take a relook at some of these gaps. One of the, I think, important formulations that all of us would argue postcolonial and decolonization has suggested is some kind of a return to tradition. I think this is by and large a kind of thinking in some outside modernity. Let's return to tradition and look at what tradition can offer. And look at tradition outside the linear modernization theory, outside the modernist gaze, tradition in itself. I think an absolutely instructive piece on this is Akhil Bilgrami's piece on Gandhi. That Gandhi, the vexed question of modernity, caste and the vexed question of modernity. I felt that's the last statement one can make on this reading that Bilgrami does, where he says that he begins by this question that why does Gandhi support Varna system? It's not a simple-minded support of caste discrimination, caste hierarchies. That's a very shorthand, quick, kind of a critique people like the kind Arundhati Roy offered. The Arundhati is a good friend, but nevertheless, let me state this. So don't let this go outside the room. That kind of critique that Arundhati offers, is something that's, I think, is a very quick hand criticism of Gandhi. That's where I think Bilgrami is very important in asking us to relocate that Gandhian engagement with Varna system was a different mode, non-modern mode of bringing about framing questions of equality. Therefore, he says that Gandhi was critical of both the liberal state-based modes of bringing equality and the market kind of modes of bringing equality, because both these projects, what they do in the name of bringing equality is actually homogenize cultural ways of life. So for Gandhi, Varna system was a certain preservation of non-monetization, non-status, non-legal sense of co-responsibility and obligation. Therefore, Gandhi gives this example of this that he is fascinated that people pursue the professions of their ancestors as an obligation to their ancestors and not due to monetary consideration. And therefore, he says this is a way of life one needs to preserve. And outside this heterogeneity, Gandhi found a method of questioning capitalism and liberal state. And therefore, what do you then, the question Bill Graham goes on to ask is, then what do you do with inequalities? What do you do with hierarchies? What do you do with caste-based discrimination? That's where Gandhi comes up with this formulation that all this has to be questioned from within the tradition. I think a lot of post-colonial and decolonial theory is terribly motivated by this idea that we need to recognize inequalities, we need to reframe question of inequalities, but not from a modernist enlightenment tradition, but within tradition itself, that we'll have to revisit. And broadly the category that they've offered is a way of life, that we need to look at these temporalities outside this linear feudalism to capitalism kind of a transition debate. You go a step outside and look at this as a way of preserving the heterogeneity of social life, which would also mean heterogeneity of a cultural way of life. So I think this question that, this question of revisiting tradition in terms of bringing social change from within tradition, I think it's time we revisit this question and head on, take and wedge open this space, that how much do we find in today's context that traditional modes of thinking, non-modern traditional modes of thinking can be useful, powerful cultural resource to bring social change. That do our traditions begin to question, frame questions of equality in a way that are radically different from modernist concepts. I would, on the contrary, argue that the current global context, what we are actually witnessing, is some kind of an unholy nexus between modern governmental power machinations and hierarchies within tradition. I think there's a kind of a fit that we are witnessing, which is what is leading to repeatedly throwing up authoritarian modes of governance. I think the consent that authoritarianism today has is, if you watch them closely, they use highly modernist technologies and highly regressive traditional. There is no alternative. So in this kind of a context, to frame questions of justice and equality in terms of a distinction between modern and tradition, I find it extremely futile. I don't think this is a productive way of framing a question, because neither your tradition nor your modern ways are actually throwing up those alternatives. So to continuously mark the radical departure of tradition from modernity, to locate its radical character, I think is a very self-defeatist kind of. It is in fact politically not throwing up any radical alternatives. That simply to refer to tradition, the only way post-colonial decolonial theory has ended up marking the radicality of tradition is how different it is from modern. I think this is a very self-defeatist mode of, very self-referential way that debate has taken a turn. And what do we do for that? How do we recover those traditions when we return this question? I think a standard formulation has been to go to the vernacular. That I think the vernacular stands as a testimony of the traditional alternatives, where you go back to the local concepts, go back to this debate about non-vernacular languages, go back to local regional languages, look at regional articulation. I refer you to Partha Chatterjee's piece on this in terms of the vernacular political science, where he makes this point very steadily that now we need to begin to do a vernacular kind of a political science, by which he simply means that we need to begin to focus on words and concepts that are used in popular language in everyday interactions and elevate those concepts into a political theory. He said that, and elevate them into political concepts which are in everyday. So he goes on to give examples like Desh, And that how Desh has a different connotations. In Odisha it means the region, in Bengal it means the locality, and you take some other examples where it means. So it does not necessarily mean nation state, but Desh has this kind of local connotations. So often the recourse has been to recover this tradition. One standard method we have been suggested is to move away from English into vernacular. Maninder is staring at me in Hindi. He stares at me only in Hindi. He doesn't stare at me in English. So he often has been a champion of taking recourse to Hindi, that that you'll have to start talking in English, Hindi, taking to Indian resources. While I have nothing against this tradition, but it's a time we actually reopen this language, that do vernacular resources naturally present us those radical alternatives. I mean, for a long time we have thought that this is a kind of a radical departure from modernity. And second, I think when we talk about the local and the regional, we imagine, the imagination that decolonialism often offers is as if these concepts do not have a social locationality. If English has a certain social global locationality vis-a-vis capital, and why we need to question, then also that question has to be extended to regional and local languages, that much of the regional languages are deeply embedded in caste-based narratives. And it's not a conjunction, it's not an happenstance that today Dalit politics very strongly all over in India imagines English as a language of liberation. So I'm only wondering now, to come back to the context, that is this a kind of a happenstance conjuncturing that is happening, that we are witnessing just when lower end caste groups are beginning to look at English as a liberating language. We have post-colonial scholars, by the way, anthropologically they all come from certain caste background, that they are reinforcing mother tongue as a one way of radical departure from modernity. I see a deeply political conjuncturing here, whether conscious or unconscious, but a deeply problematic political conjuncturing, that when that lower end caste, when they begin to demand compulsory English education, we are reminding them of mother tongues. And most Dalit politics in South, I don't know if this debate still is in the North, but in South Telangana, where I come from, today Dalit groups have no hesitation in saying that Telugu is a casteist language, because most of the slurs, most of the slang, everyday idioms, cultural idioms are deeply casteist, and the only way Dalits think they can escape this is from, look. So that also takes me to a larger cultural question, a larger theoretical formulation, which partly came in yesterday's, that how do we visit this question of being culturally embedded? Because a repeat invitation by post-colonial, decolonial scholar is to return to certain cultural embedded modes of conceptualization. Cultural embeddedness has to be sociological, which I understand. Cultural embeddedness has to be historical, which I understand. But the invite that decolonial, post-colonial scholars seem to make in Indian context is, it's a normative claim to be culturally embedded. And this normative claim, it's not a sociological claim. They're not asking us to look at history of this concept. They're not asking us to look at sociological location of this concept. They're asking us, making a normative claim, that it is normatively preferable to go back to the local. This normative claim, I feel, has a caste location. That there is, from a certain caste location, in caste hierarchical societies, I think cultural embeddedness converts into a normative moral question. It's a kind of a moral pressure they exert on you, that if you speak in Hindi, you are actually closer to reality. If you speak in English, you actually represent certain class connotation. And I find it extremely strange that Hindi claims subaltern status in India. Should ask the South Indian what we face. So this double embeddedness, double bind of Hindi hegemony is clearly visible to us from south of Vindhyas. Madam is of course Punjabi, so she's exempted from this. Okay, that takes me to my second point. Oh, 2 minutes! Don't tell me. This is terrible. Okay, then if I have 2 minutes, I'm going to skip my part on liberalism, which I had a critique. Very quickly, I'll run through this critique. I think the second important point that post-colonial, decolonial scholars often make is a critique of liberal normative order, which is a welcome critique, and I see a lot of strength in that. But at the heart of that critique is, I think, again, an absolutely instructive piece to go to this is Michael Walzer's Art of Separation, that he says liberalism is the art of separation, where it creates the separation between state and civil society and market, family and state, and it is through non-intrusion that the boundaries it builds is how it creates a language of liberties and freedom. So this is a modern project. I think at the heart of post-colonial, decolonial, again, if you take Escobar, also Nandi's writings, I think they hit out at this fragmented nature, equating that this fragmentation, this domain sphere separation as a source of modern violence, and therefore they offer some kind of a return to a way of life, an integrated organic, like Escobar argues, integrated organic way of life. Here my quick question would be that how do we separate capitalism and modernity? That I think post-colonial decolonial scholars do not make a sufficient distinction between modernity and capitalism. That do we necessarily have to have critique of capitalism from outside of modernity? Or is it that modernity itself has this double bind? I think modernity both creates violence, but modernity also creates the self-reflection for us to name something as violence. I think post-colonial, decolonial scholars do not necessarily make that distinction. My last point, which is on the current populist gist, guys, the current populist movement that we are going through, I think also raises extremely interesting questions. Because if you look at the current populist movement, it is deploying and it has successfully done up its cultural hegemony precisely on the categories that post-colonial and decolonial scholars use. I do not want to make a very shorthand direct connection the way Meera Nanda does, that post-colonial scholars have kind of opened up space for right-wing mobilization. No, I don't want to take that kind of a very reductive line. But there is a question, there is, I think, a deep theoretical question for us. What does this conjuncturing reveal for the moment? That the fact that the same categories that post-colonial, decolonial have used, have repeatedly pleaded us to return to in terms of centrality of community, culture, local, so on and so forth, is precisely the categories on which right-wing populist hegemony is mushrooming all over the world, not only in India, it's a global phenomenon. It can be framed two ways, that it is to say that post-colonial scholars got it right. It is the neglect of these categories which is what allowed for right to mobilize. The other way to read it is the deployment of these very categories that often slants towards majoritarian mobilization. So there are two ways one can formulate. I don't think post-colonial are ready to engage and wedge open that space. I think we need to really open up that space to understand what does community language does in a modernist context, because we have to remember there is no going back a pure community language. As Zygmunt Bauman says, pure communities are simply a fantasy. We all like fantasies, but that's simply a fantasy and a nostalgia. And what happens with fantasies is that they actually produce space for distorted experiences. So this repeated invocation of community by the right wing, what does it tell us? That is it that we are into a distorted fantasy which is producing this right-wing variants of different kinds of autocracies, or is it that we did not do enough with categories of community and culture, which is what is reflected in the current populist authority? Madam, I'll stop here. Thank you.
I'm not going to say anything, and just while everybody ingests all that he has said, I'm going to request Professor Sati Chand to make his presentation.
Let me try.
Oh, yes.
Thank you, Professor Mahajan. In fact, we're starting with Foucault. I think he has reserved his seat among post-colonialists, so there is no threat.
You have to speak to Mike.
Yeah.
I think you have to pull it.
I think that he is my Puru Paksh. So, the way he has, he has covered a lot of things. So, given the paucity of time, I will just flag 2-3 issues. That how this decolonization debate started. And I think it came to political theory much later. It started in social science, particularly philosophy and sociology. And in political theory, I think, or political science, it came in 80s. But now we are trying to reconstruct this entire thing slightly retrospectively. And some scholars I have seen have started arguing that it started in 50s. And the context was different. Now, this entire thing has a nationalist lineage. I mean, the cultural nationalists were the first ones who raised this, flag. Gandhian tradition was there. But 1928 piece by K.C. Bhattacharya, Swaraj in Ideas, I think became the reference point for all the scholars, particularly in philosophy, sociology, who were dealing with this question of decolonization. 1975, Indian Philosophical Quarterly, I think that journal also had a special issue on K.C. Bhattacharya. But these, I've tried to read some of them, and I find that there is a lot of misconception among these, scholars. Most of them were, of course, arguing against Western, hegemony in number of, spheres, particularly knowledge and in epistemology, but there were differences among them. And recently I have seen that J.P.S. Ali had a very, powerful critique of K.C. Bhattacharya in his Science and Swaraj piece, saying that K.C. doesn't, question the epistemic dominance of the West. And he basically operates within the same dualist frame, which is the colonialism operationalized in India. And then JPS, as I have heard him speaking also several times, he was just trying to relate it to the entire, arrangement, structural, institutional arrangement of social science and the knowledge system in the West. And he often used to mention that, how Jeno University became the first Protestant university which organized the knowledge system where theory and practice it was separated, facts and values were separated, and Karl Marx incidentally got his doctorate from that university. So, I mean, that type of arrangement of theory and practice cannot, go together, facts and values cannot go together. This type of distinction, was operationalized in India after 1857 when the first universities and colleges were established. So that epistemic thing he was raising, and then simultaneously K.C., he was saying that he would be comfortable if Indians are basically given autonomy and freedom to operate in family, in culture, in other spheres, but not in science. And science, basically, his entire quest was that we have to question if, the method and goal of science are universal, but its application has to be culturally, mediated and culturally analyzed. So that was K.C. Bhattacharya and J.P.S. Ali. I also found A.K. Saran on altogether different tip. In fact, he went to the extent of saying that we need a toolkit for decolonized knowledge and non-elitist, how among masses we can take this entire thing. So that is one important thing we should remember. That of course the signpost was freedom, liberation, emancipation in the same Swarajist Gandhian tradition, but there were finer differences. Now, in political science, in political theory, in fact, it has also this, in social science as a whole, if it has moved in phases, in political theory also it has come in phases, in different waves. In fact, some scholars have called the first wave was the phase when scholars, political scientists wanted to recontextualize the concepts which originated in the West. That was basically the 50s. Because what happened at 50s, got a nationalist flavor with the Nehruvian discourse and all that. What Parekh also basically mentions for the decline of political theory, that nationalist philosophy which Nehru gave, secularism, developmentalism, and so on and so forth, led to, digression, or one can say from the nationalist, discourse. So 50s, of course, was there, but it has a nationalist flavor, but predominantly political. This non-alignment, the global, delinking with the global capital, and all these things were going on. But at the same time, the political scientists, in particular, not other branches of social science, they got fixated with this modernization, discourse and the nation building project. So therefore, they were not questioning the conceptual, frame of the West, but they were simply trying to recontextualize it. They didn't find anything wrong with the concept, but only they started arguing that whether those concepts need to be recontextualized in our own, situation. So Kothari, in fact, is the best example. Caste in Indian politics, and many other, writings which emerged around that time on constitutionalism, on caste, or political institutions. So they were basically working with the same conceptual matrix, but trying to recontextualize it. Later on, we find a different, wave coming. That was not recontextualizing, but rather reconceptualizing. They didn't find the problem, because in the first phase, the problem was that if there is something wrong with the concept, for example, if there is something wrong with federalism, problem is not with the concept of federalism, but the context in which this has been operationalized. Something wrong with secularism, problem is not with secularism, but the context in which it has been operationalized. Now, the second wave was when they started looking at the concept itself. So reconceptualization, began. And here, in fact, a number of, scholars came on this. In fact, yesterday, some of them were referred. In fact, Professor Mahajan is sitting here. She tried to reconceptualize multiculturalism. Professor Kaviraj tried to reconceptualize, modernity, alternative modernity. In fact, later Kothari tried to reconceptualize democracy, rethinking democracy. Partha Chatterjee, political society. Rajiv Bhargav, secularism. So, they were trying to reconceptualize it. So, not only problem with the context, but also the concepts. That was second wave. The third wave, and, within, the first, in fact, interestingly, in the first, I should also mention here, in the first phase, when this modernization trip was going on, a small group, tried to distance themselves from them. And they were not comfortable with this modernization. They were not comfortable with Western modernity. And two names are often cited, V.P. Burma and B.R. Mehta. V.P. Burma used to be a teacher in Patna, in the recall. So, they said that, this entire modernity is to be interrogated. And therefore, they started, as an alternative, they started romanticizing the past. So, go back to Vedas type, discourse we often find in V.P. Burma's writings. And I think that B.R. Mehta also more or less, did the same thing in a phase. So, second phase, the reconceptualization started, but another group also emerged in this second, phase of decolonialists. And they not only reconceptualized, but they tried to use the reconceptualized categories to intervene in their debate in the West, because most of them were located there. So you have Amartya Sen on justice, Bill Gramy on secularism, Godrej and others on cosmopolitanism. Because of their locational advantage, they use the reconceptualized categories to intervene in their debate. So that was the second. The third thing starts, the third wave, and perhaps this is what Jogendraji also referred to, which is basically the latter. It is not neither recontextualizing nor reconceptualizing. It is basically deconceptualizing. That all concepts need to be, discarded. We have to start from the scratch. And this phase coincides with, the advent of this right-wing, politics and right-wing nationalism and right-wing discourse in academia and outside. So here this third phase is coming as a challenge, because now they are questioning many things, because this coincides with the collapse of the Nehruvian consensus, the kind of the way the scholars, political scientists worked with the certitudes on secularism, justice, and many other things. So this questioning, the interrogation started in a big way. So this is basically the third. How much time I have?
7 minutes.
7 minutes, okay. So this is the deconceptualization, and post-91 we find. And here this indigenous knowledge thing has become very prominent. Of course, the discourse on indigenous knowledge or indigenous tradition is not new. I didn't start with them. I remember 91, Sarah Joseph wrote a piece in EPW. I remember, 89, perhaps Professor Manoranjan Mohanty wrote a piece on changing terms of discourse. And we can recall that he had a very heated this thing in the Delhi School of Economics. Oberoi and others were basically taking on him. But he just said that, we have to relate with the people's movement and all that, how this can be rooted in people's experiences and all that. So, indigenous knowledge debate or discourse is not new. But this the deconceptualization school has basically started using this indigenous thing in a manner which basically is verging on sectarianism or whatever you call it. Now, for example, I remember in this IIC, there was one discussion. Rajiv Malhotra, who is perhaps one of, the head priest of this school, this intercultural, disparity he was highlighting. And then I also remember that he mentioned, a metaphor of tiger and a deer. He said when tiger eats a deer, the DNA is also erased. So West is like a tiger and it has eaten up the deer, we are the deer, so our DNA is totally erased. So I asked him, I said that, sir, just tell me one thing, what about our own tigers? Because you are talking about intercultural thing, but some people will get up, say that, no, there are tigers here. Because intracultural is also important, because this is being raised by the feminists, by Dalit, discourse and all that. So how to, relate the two things, intercultural, intracultural. Because intercultural, normally the signpost is freedom. But intraculture, the signpost is justice. So therefore, this decolonization, the discourse also gets stuck on this. Particularly dealing with this freedom, justice thing. So therefore, that is, a problem which is emerging. Now, of course, this is a challenge for all scholars because they are raising fundamental questions. And in fact, Jogendraji, forcefully, stirred it. That we can't, simply, wish it away or rubbish it as, a nonsensical argument. Because the argument is coming, the building argument. They may not be very sophisticated, but sophistication will also come in the next few years. So therefore, this is the major issue for decolonization discourse today in India. It has moved in waves, it has moved in phases, but it has reached a point. Now, in the meanwhile, this 1980s, in fact, I already touched on this postcolonialism, the Sadian moment, the subalterns and all that. So basically, this reverse Orientalism, which they operationalized, because this the West treated us as an object. Now this postcolonialism turned them as object, so the object-subject binary continued. So this entire decolonization debate in India was precisely on this issue, breaking this object-subject binary. Now, so therefore that is one thing. In fact, I was also reading your father's piece. He said not only with tradition, K.G. Shah, he said that not only with tradition, but in tradition, but rather engaging with tradition. You shouldn't locate yourself in tradition. How to engage with tradition, that is important. But here, in fact, engagement is not important. Anything which is tradition is basically to be adopted and embraced. So this is one thing. Now, finally, I will just, because of paucity of time, I will just wind up by, mentioning or flagging 4 or 5 issues which need to be kept in mind, particularly from the point of view of this creative theory also. Now, the thing is that this creative theory, from the very beginning, has been facing this problem, creative critical. I think we have discussed it earlier. Because a lot of, people, in fact, Gopal Guru raised this issue. He said that social science can't be creative. Creativity is the domain of art. It has to be done in isolation, individual action. Social science has to be critical, the matter of protocol. So this is one thing. Now, how this entire debate on decolonization will deal with this matter. Another thing that a lot of, scholarly churnings are going on. But the thing is that there are 2 issues which need to be addressed, frontally. question of knowing and question of being. Basically, the epistemological and ontological issue. Knowing, of course, the West had its own, tradition of knowing. Indian philosophy is very rich. One philosopher is sitting just next to me. But I would like to know that how those philosophical categories are being used and operationalized by those who are trying to reconceptualize these things. Of course, I have, I find most of the decolonial philosophers and sociologists were working with the non-dualist, epistemology. That was perhaps their most favorite this thing. But of late, of course, the Mimamsa thing I'm hearing that is also being used. In fact, Amartya Sen perhaps used the Nyaya thing for his justice thing. So, some indication that they are not going back to that. On ontology, the being issue, again I find that this Purusarth thing is coming up. In fact, Maninder's book also raises that issue, that Parel discusses this. So, Purusarth and Vikar, this is one thing. But there can be many more ways in which this being issue has to be conceptualized in Indian way. So that is second. The third thing, that ethics of theory building and politics of theory building need to be raised also, that who should build theory and for whom. The purpose becomes important. And in fact, Jogenji yesterday mentioned that because we need political theory, that's why we're debating it. Because we need it, because the challenges are there which theoretically have to be dealt with. So that is another. Second is identity question and the knowledge question. Because mostly the decolonial debate, gets bogged down to this identity issue. The West versus East, West versus India. But if you want to build a knowledge discourse, then it has to be at that level. The level at which the Western discourse emerged. So that is, and therefore this political theory in India or of India, what we were debating when we were planning this colloquium. Then this, experiential epistemology is very important, coming in a big way. The feminist, the Dalit discourse and all that brought new issues. But the question is that, do all experiences can be given the category of knowledge? Or do they have the element of ideology also? And how to do this filtration? And here, in fact, this people's politics, people-centric knowledge becomes difficult. Everything which is coming from people is knowledge, or do they have also element of biases, prejudices, ideology, and all that? And what will be the level? Because yesterday this issue came up. The theory is after all abstraction, but abstraction needs to have some foundation. But the question is that foundation part is important, where to basically anchor this foundation. And, this another important problem is that thought theory thing emerges. Because if we look at the people's movement, today Marx, Gandhi and Ambedkar, they are present all over in the people's movement, either in combination or in isolation. But those who are using them, they are not treating or they are not reading them or using them as a thinker. They are used as, as a tool to explain, as a explanatory, category. But when it comes to the university system, they become thinker. They are not, theorists, no explanatory, values attached to them. So therefore, this decolonization thing, this group has also to raise it to that level. And then there is a question of adequate theory and aspirational theory related to this. Now, aspirational theory doesn't have to go for any protocol issue. In fact, yesterday Jogenji raised this issue, that people's aspirations, protocol issue. But in fact, I remember Peter D'Souza's retort to your piece in Indian Express. And he said that, those who were talking about during colonial period or the nationalist fame, they didn't have any, they were unencumbered with this protocol thing. They didn't have any protocol problem. But, they were aspirational theorists. But today, he mentioned specifically, I remember, Amartya Sen and Bhagwati debate. He said that it passed through, a very, stringent scrutiny, scientific scrutiny. So therefore, when we're discussing today theory, we need to be, alert and conscious about this thing. Of course, you also mentioned that, it is surviving because of court cases and many other things and the PhD theses that one can always contest. Now, so that is aspirational end in this thing. And then, of course, the last thing I would like to mention that this linguistic issue, language thing, which Ajay pointed out. The Hindi versus English, or I think that most of the decolonialists would not simply argue for monolingualism or the Hindi thing. They talk of Indian languages. For example, I'm from a region, I speak Maithili. I am more comfortable in Maithili than Hindi. I often call Hindi jihadis. because when the census happened, we were clubbed with this thing. So that way. But this linguistic thing is important because ultimately the knowledge, how to create knowledge. The language in which you can, comfortably express yourself. You can imagine, you can think. Or a language which is basically you have learned. And then finally, we have to be slightly in Indian context, the knowledge and religion thing becomes problematic. Because most of the traditional societies, knowledge is wrapped in a religious frame or religious, discourse. And sometimes it becomes very difficult. For example, if you look at the traditional, experts, philosophy and other things in India, they were either the great scholars of Sanskrit, they were, the great votaries of the Hinduism, but nonetheless, their philosophy is considered important today, in today's context. So therefore, this religion knowledge separation, how this, decolonial discourse will do, will also, make a lot of difference, that in which direction. And this is here, this, the third group which has emerged, the deconceptualization group, this, Hindutva brigade. They, in fact, simply believe that knowledge is essentially a religion, wrapped. And therefore, whatever is coming from religion has to be scientific. So, I will stop here. I hope I have.
Thank you both the speakers for such rich presentations in such a short period of time and showing remarkable. But there's a lot to think about. But it has been a bit dialogical because it is directed between this tie. Now we'll make it multi, and I'm going to invite Professor Wankhede first to make his comments.
Thank you, Chair. Now, of course, it's a kind of a learning experience for me, thinking about postcolonialism or this whole idea about postcoloniality as such. Right. And this particular idea which Satish sir just suggested, that the purpose of political theory, and most of the time, even in the outside the hall, it was suggested that are we discuss somewhere the post-colonial political theory per se is distinct. Why? Because it is about what they call the Indian indigenous knowledge system, and how it is based on pre-modern traditions and resources, which can promote a better guideline to examine certain political ideas. Like for that matter, just is that there are certain pre-modern resources available. It is also appears that it is based on what they call some kind of a competitiveness towards the political ideas and institutions, like for that matter, judiciary today, which mostly emerged out of independence and suggested that they are basically borrowed institutions from the West, and therefore a critique of those ideas and institution both, and the kind of rhetoric that we have inconsistently. Third, it appears that somewhere it serves some kind of a nationalistic ego, which Ajay and Satish also mentioned, that somewhere this kind of a larger intimacy towards nativist logic or local knowledge system, which is basically create the idea of great India, and as if that we already have everything that West later on discovered, and therefore India is a Vishwa Guru. We had Pushpak Vimans, we had what they call plastic surgeries and whatnot. So everything was there in the past, and therefore the West has to learn from us and not the the reverse. And therefore this conceptualization that has taken place consistently, somewhere separate from the political problem, and therefore just the way sir suggested that the political theory needs to be embedded into the larger political context, the Hindutva's context in today's time, and what kind of a relationship, again as I mentioned, that the kind of relationship that it is making with the right wing, the post-colonial thought, or the kind of a critique of the modernity that was there from last 5 decades, how it is somewhere making a very deep, intimate relationship with the right wing, and how that can be a problem which we probably hardly think about. So I thought that what I will be doing is to suggest something which is probably part of the larger discourse today, that the idea of a constitutionalism, for that matter, and Satish has already mentioned that particular part, that do we think that somewhere constitution can become a resource to deal with political theory in India and post-colonial political theory, that somewhere that particular document is already has engaged with what they called multiple, like for that, Paul Brass is that very popular article on continuities and discontinuities, that somewhere there is a kind of a continuity from the past, and multiple ideas and other ethical values are basically borrowed from the past, and India is somewhere engaged with that very, very Okay, so this particular continuity of the past, and also that kind of discontinuity from the colonial hegemony. They had 200 years of rule in India, and how that particular somewhere the constitution is also rupturing that continuity of the colonial past, and therefore the Indian constitution is somewhere appears modern, but somewhere embedded into the past, this idea, and therefore somewhere it creates some kind of a logic that the context in which it was basically providing a particular knowledge system at that part of time creates a large resource on which these issues can be debated, like for that matter justice or hard questions like federalism. And again Satish sir discussed that particular part, that how to conceptualize India not typically federal, but also what they call state union of states. This idea that somewhere it is not only about giving some kind of a sense of map for governance, but also understanding that there are different ethnicities, languages, cultural orientation that needs to be articulated and provide some kind of endorsement. And therefore federalism became not just a kind of a colonial borrowed concept from the West, but somewhere embedded and groomed within the colonial struggle, that India requires some kind of federal value which will endorse and examine how multiple identities can be redesigned in India's colony. And therefore it is not that these concepts are borrowed, but somewhere crafted and reproduced in a very, very meticulous way during the Constituent Assembly debate. And therefore whether India should be a unitary system or not, or whether India should have some kind of a federal structure or kind of union of state, this debate is extremely powerful. Constituent Assembly debate was consistently basically bringing this particular part, that India cannot be a unitary system. So this particular concept, or for that matter the value of social justice, that how the old past of caste can be now articulated by the state, that how the caste question, the question of marginality, the question of deprivation, the question of atrocities for that matter, and the call that those who are marginalized, or the mass that has been faced historically wrongs, how this groups will be participated into the mainstream discourse today. So this concept was, of course, kind of deep engagement with the past, and through that particular engagement, a new idea of the constitution emerged. And therefore, within the constitution, we already have this very, very deep engagement with India's condition. There is a condition, there was crisis, there were challenges, and somewhere constitution were reflecting on those conditions. And therefore, when we suggest that somewhere a modernity on all these concepts are somewhere modern and Western, and therefore they are basically traveled through ship to India, and India somewhere get infatuated by those and created an alien land in India. This suggestion by the post-colonialists is somewhere very, very problematic. And the most endorsements in today's time are coming from the right wing. That the right wingers are the Hindutva proponents of the kind of a state or the logic of the India as a great world. That is basically coming from the right, and through that the argument against the constitutional validity, that whether though they suggested that of course they will be protecting on the constitution, but the values of the constitution, secularism, social justice, socialism, individual rights, freedoms, these are the values which were basically debated wholeheartedly to understand the Indian condition at that part of time, which was of course kind of had a kind of very deep record of the past, which was basically imagined that past was terrible in India, it was full of crisis, full of challenges, and somewhere the new stage will be very distinct from that particular past. So Indian constitution provided that kind of a theoretical logic, that philosophical logic around which India should be imagined, and probably the post-colonial theories are consistently neglecting that part. And within the discourse, why constitution will not be debated? Why? Because all these concepts are part of that, federalism for that matter. And therefore probably this particular issue, that in today's time when we are thinking about the purpose of the political theory, when we think that the Hindutva regime is extremely coercive and hardly understand the values and concerns which are embedded in India for the last not only 75 years, but even during the colonial struggle. These ideas and values are not modern. They are embedded into large struggle against colonial empire. And therefore, to protect that and to make sense of that, there is a purpose of political theory. And if we are not doing that, probably we are missing a large point. Thank you very much for asking me to speak.
Thank you. I'm going to invite Suhasini to please make her comments.
I'm not going to try to summarize both the speeches, but I think it's a good example of how a dialogue goes on. And we had Uttar Paksh and Purva Paksh with Professor Guruvati cogently explaining the problems with post-colonial theory and why it has remained a nudge and not been able to develop. Beyond that, while Professor Jha explained the possibilities of the decolonization debate and what it can potentially contribute to political theory, while showing that it's not a new phenomena, but there has been a long history of decolonization in India, while it came to political theory later, but there does exist a past. I'm going to do a very colonized thing. I'm going to borrow from Greek philosophy and return to first principles, like a very old-fashioned analytic philosopher, I think. I think the question we need to understand is, what exactly are we seeking to decolonize? The premise of this entire argument is that political theory is colonized in some way. Except for the exclusion of non-Western thinkers, what exactly is the component of political theory that makes it colonized? To answer this question, it is necessary to engage with the first question, and I hope, I can see Professor Vivek. Professor Vivek asked a very pertinent question in the first session today, which is that what is political theory and whether every evaluative form of political thought is political theory. I would provocatively contend that no, every form of evaluative thought is not political theory, and even more provocatively argue that it is fine, honestly, everything does not have to be political theory. I go back to the comment that Professor Yadav Yogendraji made yesterday, where he very wittily noted that it's always assumed that the smartest and the brightest in class do political theory, while the intellectual Shudras do empirical studies and electoral studies. And I think this is one of the first signs of colonized knowledge and where the idea of colonization in political theory exists, because as Dilip Menon had correctly said, that there's a dichotomy between northern theory and southern fact. So the assumption is that theory is the exclusive preserve of the West and that has been their domain of study. So as a result, when you go to a foreign university, American politics is studied in the Department of Politics, but Indian politics is studied in area studies or development studies. So my contention is that political theory is different. There is something exclusive about political theory, and I'll speak more about that later, but it is not superior. And that is one aspect of where the slight logic of colonization, if you think of colonization as hierarchy, comes in, where political theory is somehow considered superior to electoral studies, which I don't think is the case. Coming more importantly to why political theory is colonized. I think political theory has two lives, and allow me some time to explain why. One life would be a definition of political theory, and trust me, you can ask any two people who study or practice political theory and you will not find them agreeing on a definition. It's impossible. They will disagree. But you can come to a working definition of political theory, which I would say is applying philosophical principles to the study of empirical realities, and use this very thin definition to apply it retrospectively to, say, include Gandhi, Ambedkar, even Shankaracharya, or whoever you want to bring in, and say that they were political theorists. That's one life of political theory, which is based on a thin definition, and everyone in this room is invited to come up with their own definitions. The second, and this is where colonization comes in, is the institutional life of political theory. I would like to trace a short genealogy of political theory and how it developed as a discipline, which I think is very important to understand. If we look at Lee Jenko's work, she locates the beginning of political theory in the late 19th century. With the positivist revolution, there was a tendency to move towards more testable forms of analysis, and there was a move away from normative moral reasoning. At this point, political theory essentially emerged as a bridge between normative and empirical ways of studying, which is why I said that one of the ways of looking at political theory is applying philosophical principles to the study of empirical reality. This continued on, and so you have one of the earliest histories of political theory written by Sabine, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, who essentially drew a linear continuum from ancient Greek philosophy to the modern desire for justice and liberty in the context of fascism and Nazism. He was not alone. He was assisted by people like Leo Strauss and many of the earlier political theorists such as Sheldon Woolley, and that is where you get the infamous conception of political theory as from Plato to NATO. So you have Plato, who's concerned with liberty and justice, and you have NATO, who is providing liberty and justice to the newly free world after the Second World War. The reason why I draw attention to this genealogy, and I took time, and I apologize for taking time for drawing attention to this genealogy, is because this comes to my second provocative question. Why bother with political theory at all? Because if you look at his genealogy, it is inextricably linked to the post-World War II Reconstruction era, and especially after the Rawlsian revolution of 1970s, when you see the return of normative political theory, it is clearly tied to the idea of the welfare state as it's developing, and the discipline essentially developed in centers such as Oxford, Harvard, Columbia, and the global south, quote unquote, or the non-west comes into the picture much later with post-colonial theory, etc., etc. The reason why I say why bother with political theory is that people like Sanjan Subramaniam will argue that what's the exclusive benefit that political theory is providing? Get rid of that category, do history, do sociology, become a literature expert, anyone. You can pick up on any discipline. What is it so specific about political theory that we need to even retain it? Now, obviously, I have studied political theory. I am a student of political theory, so I will disagree with such a proposition, and I will say that we should retain political theory. And I think that the discipline, I'll wrap up. I think that the discipline can be reimagined, and it retains something distinctive to offer, specifically the fact that it is able to bridge this gap between abstraction and particular. And I think that is something that is necessarily not mutually exclusive. You can abstract from realities, and that is very important because it allows for exchange of ideas. And this is not something new. Exchange of ideas have always existed historically, and political theory, by being a bridge between empirical and normative, allows you to not only study it but also to initiate it. The biggest challenge, and this is something Professor Vidhu Verma raised in her discussion, which is that the problem and the greatest methodological challenge, and I'll end with this, I promise, the greatest methodological challenge facing political theory, whether that's comparative, global, critical, you can pick up analytic, normative, whichever strand it is how do we establish equivalence? We are so different. We all have different premises. We come from different background understandings. We come from different cultural embeddedness. Yet there is something inherent about us that unites us. You can call it a very thin line of humanism, but whatever it is, the minute you try to articulate it, it becomes an imposition. Because the minute I say you and I are similar because we both like chocolates, you might say I don't like chocolates. So how do you draw that line of equivalence? And I think that is the greatest that challenge facing political theory today, if it truly wants to be global and inclusive. And Indian political theory, whatever that may be and however it may develop, can contribute significantly to the discipline by developing methodological forms that will allow us to establish this equivalence in a way that it is not an imposition, and it does not impose an external structure and make an assumption that negates dialogue, but instead produces conditions conducive for dialogue. So I would just say that the focus should be on looking at the form of political theory rather than the content of political theory. There is a tendency to focus on decolonization of content, which is to say we keep expanding the canon, let's add more people, but the form remains unchanged. You're using theory as you have inherited it. But it's a dialogical process. The more you study other forms of ideas, the more you study non-Western ideas, the more you will start rethinking the way you study. So the more you change the content you study, you'll change the form of political theory. And I think by changing and modifying the political...
My apologies.
Yeah, sorry.
I think at the last sentence.
Yeah, and I think that is... Yeah, and I think that is how Indian political theory can contribute. Thank you.
Lots of material for thought and for discussion. It is now open. Okay. Now some prejudices needed. You again first.
You use the word prejudice before calling me?
That is self-description.
No. Actually, I must say, prejudice is a wonderful category because it reminds us that we start any discussion with prejudgments, that nothing starts in vacuum, and that therefore all of us speak in traditions. I'll come back to that. Tradition is not something which is exclusive to someone sitting and wearing different clothes. It's a primary condition of human thinking that we think in and through traditions, which is exactly what we have been doing for the last 1.5 days. Except that it's not a tradition. Sovereignty was destroyed. Our industries were destroyed. Was our mind also destroyed? We have to think, we have to respond to this question. Saying that right wing says so is a very poor answer, because we forget that while Modi ji invokes Hindutva and Hindu Rashtra every day, he also invokes poverty. Every day, every scheme of his is targeted at the poor, at the disadvantaged. Can we use that as an argument to say that the left has created the background for Mr. Modi to emerge because he talks of poverty and disadvantage? That would be absurd, wouldn't it be? Which brings me to the question of tradition. Tradition, as I initially hinted, can have two different meanings. All of us somehow have started believing in that old modernization nonsense, that there is modernity with capital M and tradition with a capital T. We've forgotten the elementary meaning of the word tradition. And in that sense, Ajay, you are as much traditional. Your tradition may happen to be Marxism, but we all are very traditional people. You do not step out of tradition. So the choice is not going back. I'm astonished at this metaphor of back, going back. I mean, I've heard that over the last 2 days several times. Going back where? To whom? You know, traveling from JNU to Munirka is surely not going back. It's probably going in. And there, once we acknowledge that all thinking takes place within traditions, then the question is not whether we should be traditional or not. The question is whether we should follow the tradition of Foucault, Rawls, and Nozick, and what you have, or we follow the tradition of A.K. Sarana or others. So that's not a choice. Just one final thing about languages. I'm truly astonished to hear what you said. Telugu is casteist. I mean, every single language in this world is embedded in power relations. You know. So, if I were to put what you said together, it seemed to suggest that every language other than English is embedded in power relations. You know, surely, and to invoke Dalits and some Dalit intellectuals to defend this, to my mind, violates all elementary reasoning. And what amazes me is that we as intellectuals of India have regressed. We are going back in a debate which took place far more productively, in a much more rich manner in the 1960s. And the debate was never between English and Hindi. May I suggest that it is the English-speaking elite, super elite of India. It's not just the elite. It is the super elite of India, which always, in order to defend its cultural English hegemony, brings in the question of Hindi. A question which no one raised in the 60s. It was always between, please forget Hindi walas, just read U.R. Anantamurthy. It's English versus Bhashas. That is the real question. And incidentally, it is not a choice. If you want to do political theory, then just like if I wish to do a political theory of Britain, understanding English language is not a choice. That's the only starting point I have. So therefore, Telugu is not a question of choice. It is the only way to start doing political theory. Just one last thing, good
I have to ask the organizers to have another seminar.
Just one last thing. Just to endorse the question that the interlocutor asked towards the end. And I would invite everyone in this seminar, especially younger scholars, please, seminar खत्म हो जाएगा, बाद में जाके अपने आप से पूछना है political theory में हम करते क्या हैं? What do we get? I'm not saying we don't get anything. I think we get something. But do we get anything more than some English phrases that frighten others? Do we get more than some names that we can bombard people with? जिससे पहले हम 6 महीना डरते थे, उससे हम दुनिया को डराते हैं. What more are we getting? And let me repeat, I think we get something more. In fact, Ajay, in his critique, referred to something very beautiful. Partha Chatterjee's analysis, which you debunked, actually is one of the finest analysis of good political theory. Thank you.
Okay, I look this side. There are lots of questions, but I'm going to look this side first, just to keep the balance, right and left. Ananya.
That will not come.
Oh, okay. In mind. Sorry, I just quickly want to actually call Yogen Bhai out. Because you've been doing this since last evening. I think you want to have your cake and you want to eat it also, you know. So I'll tell you why I'm saying that. Yes, all political theory draws on epistemological traditions. Those traditions can have different historical, political, social, and cultural contexts, and we can locate ourselves in this or that or both. And many of us are working in translation, we are multilingual, we are also multitasking in terms of having to know, political theory as it comes out of the continent and trying to deal with our own
traditions, our own epistemic traditions. I think the thing you keep saying is that, we're disconnected from the reality, where you go out there, it's not outside the IIC, etc. I think this is, it gets you a lot of rhetorical cachet, but it's false, actually, I think. I'm sorry to say, to put it strongly, because the distinction you want to make, and that is a real distinction, is between political theory and politics. And as a rare individual who has moved between these two realms, you may well see a discrepancy between what people are thinking, doing, and believe themselves to be thinking and doing out in the political world, in the political hurly-burly, in which you also participate, and what theorists, academics, intellectuals, analysts, interpreters, people like ourselves, teachers, writers, we are doing when we try to analyze and conceptualize political categories which have a certain relationship to the historical and the real, right? So it's not fair for you to say, I think, that we are disconnected from that. We are connected with that world in the way that our discipline of political theory allows us to be. We take it as an object, right? But as a practitioner, as an activist, as a politician, you have a different relationship now. You didn't for like most of your life, but now you have a different relationship. Yeah. So I just want to say that you shouldn't like take easy. This is a cheap shot, basically, and that shouldn't be done.
Good evening, everyone. So actually, earlier I asked similar question, but this time I'm expecting a more precise and specific answer. So actually, in this conference, we are discussing about the post-colonial and decolonization of modern Indian political theory, and discussing that decolonization thing in English itself. And rather, right wing, they are also talking about claiming of their regional languages, and through that claiming their culture. And the three-language policy of NAP 2020 is being implemented
into tradition. It seems to me there's two options you can take for what you mean when you say that returning to tradition is no longer viable. Option one is to say, look, we've done a lot of work here. The challenges we face are new. There are other places we can look at, like the Constitution. So let's look away from tradition. Option two is to say that something has gone critically wrong with what we're taking into the tradition, the problems that we're refracting through it, that we're not properly expressing our contemporary needs and sympathies. Which of these two options are you taking? It feels like everyone has assumed you're taking the first. If that is true, why have you rejected the second?
Good.
Yeah. There were two. Yeah, please.
My question is also for Professor Gudavarti. Thank you so much for such a provocative, sharp presentation.
You will get 1 minute to answer.
So the question is, you said that the idea of taking vernacular seriously in political theory is a normative sort of step. And so I wanted to ask you, especially if you take an interpretive view of political theory, right, we are dealing with a phenomena for which practitioners already have a pre-understanding in a conceptual language. Right? It's not like natural phenomena, which is dumb. How can you understand a phenomena of which practitioners already have a conceptual understanding without at least starting with those concepts? You can say that those concepts are unclear, they are vague, but what could possibly be the justification for ignoring those concepts? Thanks.
Yes, please.
The title of the session, right? The title of the session was Indian Political Theory and the Issue of Decolonization. So when we are talking of decolonization, how can we start with, say, buying books on a history of political theory? Because the book starts with the writings which were done by the church. And then that is where we get trapped in the question of political theory, that if the starting was from the writings of the church, say St. Augustine and others, then how can we do political theory today? So we can't say that everything that is being done in the history that is being written, that is fine, that is an interpretation, and that should be taken, well taken. But when the question is of decolonization, that is where the question of Indian political theory emerges. We cannot then say that since Samim has written this, so this is how it should be done. So that is my question to everyone who can answer. Thank you.
This thing of language has been coming up also from Ananya's earlier presentation.
Will continue. It is not ending here.
Okay, 3 minutes. I can only thank the organizers. Thank you very much.
That is 30 seconds. Now you have 2.5 minutes. 30 seconds.
30 seconds. Okay. So let me begin by Yogenji's very animated response. But I think you have heard me wrong, Yogenji, on many fronts. One, I think I have very categorically said that I avoid Mirananda's kind of a very easy kind of collapse of post-colonial and Hindutva right, and I was not taking Hindutva right as a excuse to critique. So that's not. My point was in terms of the new context that has emerged, where questions of cultural colonialism that we raised 50 years back, I think need to be revisited in a new light of specifics. I think there has been a tradition of formulations, like I said, question of tradition, question of community, the question of vernacular. I think I'm arguing that there are new set of issues that have emerged forthright after that. And therefore, in that context, I made this point that when it comes to the question of regional language, there are new voices that have got articulated in terms of power relations within regional language. What do we do with that question? So it's not just about dismissing or pitching English versus Hindi or Telugu versus, but when you have new social constituencies raising new forms of articulations, how do we take them on board? And my point was that perhaps old modes of framing that post-colonial theory offers may be inadequate in taking on these new questions. Therefore, that also takes me to Vivek's question that, that local concepts. So I'm not dismissive of local concepts, but this understanding that local concepts are some kind of foundationalism. I think we have had this discussion also when you came for my book discussion, that I refuse to treat these concepts as some foundational, where, they're wellspring of. I think they themselves need to be interrogated. So my question would be, what would be the vantage point to also interrogate that local, that regional, that which is local cultural idiom? I think that itself needs interrogation. I don't think there's an easy way of equating the local with lived experience. I mean, this is a big categorical fallacy. I mean, it's a categorical mistake simply to say that the moment you have local, you are closer to the lived experience, because experience itself is a social construct through existing categories and concepts. There is nothing like experience which is a datum. Experience itself is a historical context, and I think it came up in Gurpreet's presentation that culture is always open to interpretation. Therefore, we experience the same sense of reality in very many different times within a different time and space. Therefore, this method that post-colonial adopt, the moment you shift to the regional and local, you are closer to some kind of an authentic reality from where you will start questioning the colonialized mind. I think it's highly politically problematic for me. I think this local itself needs to be interrogated, and for that there is no easy space. You'll have to construct, and that is where politics comes in, that you'll have to construct those newer spaces where you have to do both external colonization and internal interrogation. So I'm saying that does post-colonial and decolonial adapt to that new question? So I'm raising a series of new questions that we'll have to move beyond the old way things have been imagined and formulated. And in terms of this question of return of tradition, I think it's an important question that we need. It will require a lot of time. But the larger point I was trying to make is that when we discuss whether the question of tradition or modernity, there's always a context in which we discuss. There is nothing like taking recourse to tradition or not taking recourse to tradition, wanting modernity or not wanting modernity. I think those are not useful questions to frame. And the question has to be framed in a context. So I'm asking that in the context of late capitalism, shift from manufacture to financial capitalism, shift from exploitation to expropriation, I see a new nexus that has emerged between local traditions, being sucked into global value chains, and therefore modernity and tradition have a different kind of an access to it. Therefore, there's no point going back and reframing the question and again, it's tradition versus modernity. Tradition will give you an alternative to. That's where I asked, what is the equation between capitalism and modernity? Do we see modernity as a source of a critique of capitalism, or do we think that critique of capitalism has to come exclusive from outside modern? Lot of post-colonial literature takes recourse to this argument. No, it should be outside interests. It should be not about economy as a specialized sphere. That's the critique of Marxism, right? So should that necessarily be, or does modernity provide us also a language of a critique of capitalism? And where do we account for that? Because modernity, I think, is a double-faced, a Janus-faced phenomenon. It produces violence, but it also gives us categories to name it as violence. And one should not lose woods for the trees. That's the point. Madam is staring at me. Her language will now become very violent, so I'll stop here.
Message, no language.
Yeah, just brief comment. I agree that, it's different between claim and reality. This is what they claim, that we are deconceptualizing. All concepts which were being used in social science in general, in political theory in particular, need to be discarded, and we have to go for new concepts. That is the claim they are making. But the fact of the matter is that that requires 2-3 things: a new conceptual universe that needs a new epistemic frame. And if you look at their writings, their discourses, most of them are more modern and more Western than many other theorists and social scientists in India. And this is not true only with this page. In fact, we can start with Savarkar and you can go back to any number of their ideologues. So they were operating with the same epistemic frame. So I think that is true with their history. That is, apart from Arun Sauri and that Goyal, they have not been able to find out a good historian to give alternative set of historical facts till now. And also for theoretical resources, they are banking on, most of the category. Just by renaming them, it can become, Indian, or it can become indigenous. So that is one thing. And I would like to see that how they are using the new Indian philosophical category to engage with some of the political issues. That will be the real test. So we have to wait and see that whatever research they are producing.
So it's been my great privilege to have listened to these very thought-provoking and thoughtful presentations. Also to the exchanges.
Oh, you want this one? Should you? इसी को ले लीजिए ना. इसको बंद.
Should I say, my privilege of having been here to have listened to this and to the discussions and debate, because seminars are meant to be suggestive. So we've got, I think, a lot of food for thought, and we'll go back thinking. I will go back thinking about it. So far I've said it's been a privilege, but it's also been an opportunity, because I can insert my voice now. So I'm going to misuse the next 5 minutes, because I'll share with you what I'm taking back and how I'm responding to some of the questions that have come up. Suhasini raised this very interesting question, and she made this statement that if you ask anybody what is political theory, there'll be no consensus. People have different views, which is entirely true. And when we can't get an idea of what X is, we look at history to see how it has got defined, and that gives you some meaning. So to the Western idea that you gave, I'm going to insert a little bit from a part of our history when the paper of political theory was introduced in Delhi University. It was the first of its kind. And I think that was the beginning of doing what I would call Indian political theory as it got defined yesterday, thinking about the Indian experience. We were not going to do thinkers. This was going to be cast only in the framework. There were 2 frameworks, liberal and Marxist. So you could define either in any kind of way, socialist, Marxist. It was only to discuss questions of rights, justice, equality, liberty. And I thought that's the starting point of saying, look, we are not going to be thinking only about, because our problem is not that we do West or whatever, we just didn't know and have not known how to do any kind of teaching of political thought and theory. Because when I studied, and maybe when I taught also, I did the same thing, which was all wrong. I learnt it like, wisdom comes very late in life, what to do. Yes, we did. It rubs off. तो अच्छा है किसी को तो आया ना. So we used to do that. Plato, theory of education, theory of philosopher kings, theory of ideas. It just loses the point. But I won't get into how we should do political theory. We've already got another idea of Indian political theory, which has come from Harish. So I'm starting with the discussants first. And Harish said that maybe the beginning was made at the time of discussing and drafting and making of the constitution, where they were engaging with multiplicity of ideas of past and present and tradition. And I'm so glad Yogendra indirectly brought in Gadamer, since you mentioned prejudgment instead of prejudice. Prejudice is prejudgment. And he has this idea that any kind of reading is this fusion between tradition and what you are bringing to bear in it. And that tradition is really the past. And the past we are carrying with ourselves are many. And this came up in the morning also, Savita and so many other people, that we have to think of that tradition as being carrying within it so many voices. So the past we are carrying and engaging also comes mediated. It is not pure. It is mediated in multiple kinds of ways and so on. And I can't resist this before I come to the final 2 points. Yogendra, you make this very interesting analogy. You referred to this yesterday, JNU to Munirka. And a thought comes to mind I'm going to share with you. Because the nexus is not travel from one to the other. The nexus is very deep. That's what I want to say. I think it depicts the way I look at Indian political theory. Because many students in JNU, also faculty, stayed and preferred to stay in Munirka as a viable option and move back and forth. So a lot of movement, free movement back and forth. And the other moment that comes to mind is when the riots in 1984 took place, the faculty and students of JNU took out a candlelight march, peaceful march, silent march, and they walked to Munirka and back to ensure that there are no incidents. And that march was sufficient. So I think this interpenetration, that's not too far. They were there, they knew how that is thinking, and their presence also, the theoretic, we call it, if you think of JNU as is intellectual space or whatever, but it's also a lived space. That intervention into that, and there was a kind of, this sometimes breaks down and we have to ask why. It did break down, we have seen it. So, but I couldn't resist those memories of the JNU Munirka, so thank you for reminding me. But what I'm taking away from the presentations, I think there's a lot, but only one or two things I want to flag here. It occurred to me that maybe what is happening, because we are thinking about what did we get there, we begin with a certain idea, and I think that's how political theory or thought really functions. We begin with certain ideas and they take on a positive form and become hegemonic, identifying and specifying something which then becomes also has a normative power. Decolonization came in what would have been called, since this is also in association with the Herbert Marcuse Foundation, so thinking of the Frankfurt School, the negative moment, which destabilizes that hegemonic presence. And I think that's what the decolonial thought did, decolonial theory did. It came in as that moment, that negative moment, which destabilizes and opens a space for interrogation. The problem arises when the negative becomes, as it were, becomes stabilized, hegemonic, and begins to take one kind of form. And I think we may be seeing that in what you are suggesting, that this is the sort of thing that happens, and then there are new sets of problems that come up. And that's the movement of ideas. In the old days, they called it dialectic. We'll forget about that word. But this is how the movement that we are ourselves dissatisfied. That's where experience comes in. Experience comes in and it sort of destabilizes, says, You raise all these questions which have come up through the experiences of various people, and they begin to question that if it takes a stabilized form and gets appropriated in certain kinds of ways, because that's the form, it is becoming stable, then we need to think of a movement to destabilize it and see, and then you begin to look for new resources. If you're looking for it, will modernity provide us, or has resources which we might take? There may be some other resources also within tradition that might be used, but we'll have to create that new framework, which will be momentary. So I will not call it sense synthesis or anything like that, because that distorts the whole process. This is the movement of ideas, and this is the movement of not just freedom but of emancipation, because you will begin to create something when slowly and gradually contradictions will emerge. You'll find that it has perhaps not lived up to the idea or the promise it came with, and you look for change. That's what I've learned from political theory, wherever it came from, and I think it has been a useful thing for me, because I see this now in evidence in the debates that's going on in Indian political theory. So thank you so much for bringing that to mind. Several other things, but thank you to the speakers, discussants, to everybody here. My apologies if I cut short, but I said I have limitations.
Finished at 5.
I sort of expressed that. So please bear with me. Seek your forgiveness for interventions and rude behavior.
रूट तो मिलते हैं आप
रूट तो हमेशा